My friend Aaron commented on the video about physical resilience and building up habits of good eating, good exercise, and good sleep so that you can stand up to the stress and physical demands of being an entrepreneur. That those individual hacks and habits are all well and good, but it's hard to keep all areas of that health triangle going: the diet, the exercise, and the sleep. And nailing all of those consistently at the same time is tricky. So I will talk in this video about how to juggle and manage all those different habits. Hi, I'm Alec from Easier Habits, and I help overthinking entrepreneurs in how to turn their overwhelm, procrastination, and anxiety into unstoppable execution. So the first thing I'm going to say is that before you have a lot of habits to manage, you actually need to have a habit. For some of you, you may feel like you don't have any consistent habits in your life. Sure, you might have routines from time to time, but they're usually short-lived when you have a high motivation or high discipline, and they disappear when the motivation or discipline flags when you're burnt out or when your schedule changes. You might also have routines that are the path of least resistance. For example, of the first type, I would go on exercise kicks sporadically through, college and my early work years, whether that's, doing body weight exercise at home or barefoot running. I tried a number of different things, but those would be short-lived and kind of die out with my motivation. In contrast, when I was working in computers, I would find I would have an afternoon lull, and to stay awake, I needed to go on a walk. And that was actually easier than working when I was tired. And so I fell into that habit. But when my schedule changed, and I started working for myself, for example, I didn't have the same routine. I could just go and take a nap, which at most workplaces is difficult to do. So that habit of going and walking outside, getting some sunlight, etc., and all the positive things attendant with that disappeared when my schedule changed. And so if you're in that position where you're actually not keeping a habit consistently across different levels of stress and different schedules, that you don't have a habit that is helpful to you in almost all circumstances, then I would say you really haven't found or developed your first true habit, or what I would like to call the light bulb habit. For me, this habit that I started to keep, and it morphed into different habits as I tested other habits in, but my light bulb habit was yoga. At the time I lived in a Japanese apartment I was super allergic to and could barely breathe, and I'd be wheezing. And also, it was cold. It was up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere in January, so it was cold all the time. And I found that if I did 10 minutes of yoga, maybe 15, I would have hours of being relatively allergy-free and being able to regulate my own body temperature so it wasn't cold all the time. And then I realized, wow, if just 10 minutes can give me hours of a much higher quality of life, then maybe these habits are worth keeping. And so I learned to keep that habit. And, it was like a light bulb. Once I realized that some of these chronic low quality of life issues, tiredness, allergies, coldness that I was used to dealing with, I could troubleshoot with habits. I started experimenting with all sorts of other habits to see what was more effective. And I eventually found that actually Wim Hof breathing was really my most effective habit in terms of alertness throughout the day and fighting tiredness as well as allergies. So the kind of yoga habit morphed into Wim Hof breathing. And as I discovered the miracle of habits, I had that first light bulb habit. I started adding more and more habits, especially into my routine. Fast forward to a point in California where I had like a 90-minute routine before work, which included prayer, meditation, running, reading, journaling, exercise. I already said that, but breathing exercise, in addition to jogging. And I was like cramming all of those things in 90 minutes. And it was a lot. And it was a lot to maintain. And when I eventually left the coding job, went to work for myself as an entrepreneur, I didn't have the same structure. And I discovered that some of the multiplicity of habits I had developed really were kind of in the second category, i.e., when I had certain pressures in my schedule, they were easy to do, right? I knew I had to be at work at a certain time or else the traffic would be horrible. And I knew that I wouldn't do the habit, many of these little habits, especially health ones, after I came home and I had dinner with the kids, cleaned up dinner, played with the kids, and then by the time it's 8:30 or whatever and I'm done with the family routine, I probably wouldn't do a lot of these habits. So I had a couple evening habits but not many. And so I realized that a lot of those went away, and that kind of brings up the question, how do you manage all of these habits so that you're healthy, so that you have these diet habits, these exercise habits, and these sleep habits to keep yourself functioning optimal? And really, I have three strategies. Strategy one is identify your keystone habits. This comes from a book called The Power of Habits by Charles Duhigg, I believe. And he talks about keystone habit as a habit that has an outsized impact on the rest of your life, or that makes other habits easier. So for example, one study found that people who exercise not only feel better, like lose weight, have more energy, or build muscle, whatever it is, like the direct exercise related benefits, but they also found it easier to quit smoking, or more of them quit smoking. And so that was a keystone habit in the fact that it affected more than one thing. So going back to my light bulb habit, very often those are also keystone habits in the sense of you discover the power of a habit and become a convert to the power of habits because you found a habit that has an outsized impact on your day. And so again, an example of that was the breathing exercises. If I do those, my allergies are drastically reduced. I go from a place where I can almost never breathe through my nose to a place where I can breathe through my nose regularly, from a place where I'm regularly having sinus infections to a place where I'm not having sinus infections. And also, more importantly for me, actually, a lot of my chronic tiredness, especially the mid-afternoon slump around 2 or 3 o'clock, that goes away with just 10 minutes of breathing in the morning. Plus, if I'm doing the breathing in the morning, I am becoming more alert earlier in the day, and especially as an entrepreneur, I'm getting into work and getting more done earlier before my kids come home from school. So that's a lot of benefits. If you compare that to example for my VR boxing, it is true that if I do VR boxing every day and combine that with yoga and the other like eating and drinking practices, I feel at my best. But if you compare the results of me just doing even that normal aerobic exercise to the breathing exercise just by personal experimentation wins out every time. It is clearly more powerful. I don't have to do it. It's easier for me to do, and it's usually quicker, 10 minutes versus like 15 or longer, especially if you consider a cool down with the exercise. And so, there is a clear difference in this case between the breathing exercise for me, which is a keystone habit, and the VR boxing, which is a nice to have and can add some benefit on top, but is not adding the same benefit, especially the benefit for the effort. So that is an example. The other real keystone habits that I have, intermittent fasting. So not only does it cut down on the junk food I eat during the day, which means I pack on fewer pounds. It also means that I'm not crashing my energy level after eating a bunch of carbs, so it helps with energy. And it also helps with sleep because I'm not eating late at night. I have to have a long period where I'm not eating, and that means that I'm not eating late at night and interrupting my sleep or getting lower quality of sleep. And a third one would be drinking water because, again, it helps with the alertness. And so if you're dehydrated, your brain gets tired and foggy easier. Plus, it also helps with the diet. If you're drinking water, you don't feel as hungry as you would if you're dehydrated. Sometimes when you feel hungry and you're tempted to snack a lot, it might actually be because you're not getting enough water, and that's why you kind of feel empty. Right? And if you drank some water, you wouldn't need to snack as much. So the drinking water is another keystone habit. And probably the last one would be, some form of like prayer and meditation for the mindset, the stepping out of, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I'm gonna die. Kind of that freak out, the overwhelm when, especially if I start something new or if there's a challenge, like, most recently my wife having surgery and having health issues and trying and finding it difficult to get back up to speed after that, I'll be in a very stressed state that will impact all sorts of health and work outcomes. And so having a routine to ground myself and calm myself is has an outsized impact on my ability to focus and work during the day. So those would be some keystone habits. The things that are not my keystone habits, they would be intentionally cutting out carbs during the period where I'm eating. It's nice to have. I can get by without it. But on weeks where I'm consistently intermittent fasting for longer, maybe say 18 to 20 hours instead of 16 hours, and cutting out carbs except for at dinner, then those are some of my best energy weeks. It's just a lot of effort to do that consistently. And so it's not a keystone habit, and it doesn't have as big impact as just that first 16 hours of intermittent fasting. And so another second tier habit would be some of the other things around sleep, like going on a walk before I sleep or cutting out screen time intentionally. Most of the time I just let that happen. I have like a natural inclination, for example, to like play with my cat or read a little bit before I go to bed. So most of the time having screen time not before bed, I don't have to intentionally focus on. But sometimes I really make a go of it and, go walking in the dark to kind of let out my energy, my last energy, and relax. And let's see what else. Exercise. So like the VR boxing I already talked about, but like there's yoga and stretching I do, and I like how I feel when I'm limber and yogaed up. But that has much less impact on my alertness and the ability to work, for example, during the day. So that's a second tier thing. So identify what are your keystone habits and what are secondary. Hold to at least your keystone habits and then layer secondary ones on top of that. They are more optional than the keystone ones. And that way you have a baseline of, and you want to make sure you have keystone habits that cover all three areas. Not a ton of them, but like I said, I have like 3 or 4. That like less than 5 or less is probably a good number of like keystone habits to cover those aspects of your physical health. And I think one of the 4 I listed really was more of like a mental health keystone rather than a physical direct. I'm sure like eventually, the two interacts, level of stress will interact with physical, but I'd say like actually, I really only have 3 physical health keystone habits: breathing exercises, drinking water, and intermittent fasting. So if I have those, I will keep a fairly good ability to work throughout the day, feel fairly good, have a good level of energy, etc. Be very functional. And then the second tier are ones that do help me perform at my best. And so when I was really stressed over the summer, it was helpful to make sure I kind of adopted VR boxing because it was both exercise and stress relief. Like punching at things was very relieving when I had stress or when I was frustrated about something. And so that actually temporarily bumped up, I would say, over the summer to a keystone habit, and I really adopted that into my routine. And so these things can change, but you want to take inventory of what are they right now for you. And as your schedule changes, you might find 1 or 2 of them shift in and out, but probably there's a few things that you always need. I always have, the circulation issues and chronic tiredness that may be related to circulation. So the breathing exercise is always a keystone habit. So distinguish between those. Tip 2 would be go ahead and scale down both keystone and secondary habits instead of cutting out them completely. So it's always better to, for instance, for me to do a short version or at least 1 round of breathing exercises than to do none. It's better for me to do 1 minute of push-ups with no rest at the top and bottom, just slow, constant load, a body weight load. That actually turns out to be a fairly effective exercise. It's much more condensed than doing 16 minutes of VR boxing plus yoga and whatnot. And it's better than doing nothing. So that's an example of scaling down that, I've already kind of shown an example of my intermittent fasting is a scale. I generally do at least 16 hours, but I will scale that up in the weeks where I can. And if I can't, I usually try and hit at least 16 hours. And so that's tip 2 is scale down rather than cutting out completely. And there's some great tips around that and examples in Atomic Habits, James Clear's book. The third tip for managing your habits has to do with adjusting it to meet your needs and your schedule at one particular moment in time. If I had to guess, for my friend Aaron and a lot of other people, one of the hardest parts of keeping habit is that your life isn't the same. For people with seasonal affective disorder, they're going to have different needs in one season versus the next. When your schedule changes at work or with family, that's going to impact when and how you can do what things. And, if you have less time in the morning, it will and you have to wake up earlier to get your full routine in. That puts, stress on how much you can get done in that time. And some habits will start looking less rewarding, at least for the effort involved to do them. And that's especially true of your non-keystone habits. So you basically can't assume that one stack of habits in one particular schedule will serve you for the rest of your life. Your life is going to be changing. So the third thing I do to manage my habits and balance all of my health habits for eating, sleep, and exercise is a weekly check-in. Now, I might do another video about that another time where my weekly, I talk about my weekly check-in, and I cover areas of family life and work and spirituality, and then just general personal well-being, physical and mental. And usually there's a bullet point as I'm reviewing the last week of something that I felt had a big impact on me the last week, whether it was not eating well, not sleeping well, not doing the exercise. I haven't been doing the VR boxing for a week, or that drops out of my habit for a week after I've been doing it for months, just because I was burnt out that week or was vacationing or who knows what. And so I'll usually have a bullet point of one thing to focus on the next week to bring a habit back into play, or experiment with a new habit, or tweak a habit to adopt to my new schedule. So an example of that would be just this week. I have a goal of unplugging by 9:45 at the computer so that I can have go to bed earlier, more consistently, and with a nice buffer of non-screen time before I go to sleep, because screen time can lower your quality of sleep. And so sleep was one of the things that I felt I wasn't doing as well last week, as I was trying to do a lot at work and then figure out work situations with Meg and adjust to her ongoing complications as a result of the surgery. Not medical, the surgery went fine, it was great, but just she has chronic health conditions that have been affected by the surgery. So with all of that, right, I was staying up later, a little bit more stressed. Not as bad as I was at sometimes, the staying up till 1 p.m. or 1 a.m. or later watching YouTube videos or scrolling or binging a show, right? I didn't do that, but I was still passing 11 o'clock, which really isn't enough sleep for me, considering I want to get up at 6:30. I do family prayer with the boys, etc. So I realized that I wasn't getting enough sleep last week. Make this goal, and my goal for sleep usually is unplugging the computer, which is the hard part for me. If I can make that goal, then the falling to sleep happens naturally as I get bored. What will I do without a computer? Oh no! I play with my cat a little bit. I do read. I usually talk to Meg a little bit earlier in the evening because her sleep schedule varies. But anyway, so that's all to say. I have this constant weekly adjustment process, and that's the third aspect of balancing. If you think about balancing as you walk or ride a bike, it is not a static action. It's not finding one perfect position and staying there. It's about adjusting to micro influences one way or the other. And it's the same thing with habits, that you'll have things that make certain habits more impactful. You'll have things that make them harder or less rewarding. And then you'll just have to adjust on a week by week basis. And so, typically, if you have those keystone habits, things that have an outsized impact, you figure out a way to do them anywhere, anytime. And so those are the ones I'm least likely to need help with. But what I spend a lot of my time juggling in these weekly check-ins would be, how to get as many of those second tier habits in as I can to feel optimal, and then occasionally swapping one out to try something else to see if it helps more, is more motivating, feels better, etc. It helps me stay awake, more productive. I have different yardsticks for different things, but I do experiment, optimize, etc. Or, when I'm missing something, bring that back into my schedule in these weekly meetings. So those are the 3 things that help you balance your habits. So first is find your keystone habits and stick to them, and then layer secondary habits on top of that. For both keystone and secondary habits, but especially for keystone, you want to have ways that you can shrink them or reduce them if you're under pressure, you're burnt out, have limited time. You want to do something rather than nothing, and that will be more bang for your buck. And the third thing is just adjusting week to week, because your needs will change. So, and then if you don't have habits yet, if you're thinking, I would love habits, but I don't really have I don't feel like I have the discipline to consistently stick with one habit. I don't think it's you or your discipline. Like, discipline for everybody rises and lowers. But for most people, what they need to find is a keystone habit, a habit that has an outsized impact on their day, that's rewarding enough to stick with it. And basically, the value of that is, sure, you might have an off day, and I have off days occasionally, even in my keystone habits, but I feel the impact. And so the chance that I will get through a day without doing a breathing exercise, for example, is relatively low, because at the point during the day where I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't do that at my normal time in the morning, and I'm feeling that now, I'm likely to stop for just a couple minutes or even 5 minutes and do a quicker, smaller version of that and bring that back. And then I will notice a pretty immediate impact, and that impact will last in terms of alertness for a few hours, if not most of the day. So when you have a habit that's rewarding, you don't have to rely on discipline or motivation. It's naturally rewarding in and of itself. So you keep doing it to get the reward. So that is how you become a fan of habits and build up so many habits that it's hard to keep them all. And 3 tips that you can do to manage your habits once you've started amassing a body of habits that help you feel at your best. Until next week, make big changes, one small habit at a time.